In the heart of New York City, one quiet professional just wanted to do their job. But behind the walls of a crumbling building on Fulton Street, a pattern of silence, fear, and power was waiting to be exposed. When a routine inspection uncovers more than just broken pipes, one social worker finds themselves face to face with a landlord who's been untouchable for years. Threats begin to pile up. Rumors spread. The system that should protect the vulnerable turns its back. But instead of walking away, they dig deeper. And with every file, every name, every witness, the silence begins to crack. Now the city has no choice but to listen. One voice became many. One case became a movement. But when power fights back, will justice hold? You've heard the whispers, now uncover the truth. Was the system too broken to fix? Or did Jordan finally force it to change? Comment your thoughts, and if you believe in truth over silence, don't forget to like and subscribe. Jordan Ellis stood outside the red brick building on Fulton Street, shoulders slightly hunched against the early March wind. The cold tunneled between buildings, catching the edges of their coat and tugging at their scarf. The morning had started like any other coffee-packed lunch, a short train ride from Bed-Stuy to downtown Brooklyn. They walked this block a dozen times before, visited this property more than once, but today felt different. The building loomed, one of those older complexes with faded awnings and mailboxes that hadn't been replaced since the late 80s. Rent stabilized. Mostly older tenants, a few families, and a handful of folks Jordan knew only by first name and apartment number. Their job was simple: check on tenant complaints about the heat, inspect the units, document the conditions. It was routine, logged in the system days ago, approved by the department, following protocol to the letter. Jordan pulled out their work ID and clipped it to their coat, the laminated badge catching a glint of the gray morning light. As they stepped through the entrance, the familiar smell of radiator heat and old cleaning products filled their nose. The building was quiet, too quiet. Mrs. Alvarez, a tenant on the second floor, met them near the stairs. "You got my report?" she asked in a low voice, glancing nervously over her shoulder. Jordan nodded. "We're following up on the heating issues. You weren't the only one who filed, so we're just making sure everyone's okay." "I didn't tell him it was me," she added quickly. "You understand." Jordan did. Tenants rarely wanted their names attached to complaints. The fear wasn't always spoken, but it was always there. Retaliation came in subtle forms: missed repairs, delayed lease renewals, sudden inspections that turned aggressive. And here in a building owned by Walter Kent, that fear was justified. Jordan moved through the lobby, checking the thermostat, noting the lack of warmth. They asked a few polite questions, listened carefully, made their observations without causing a stir. The same way they always did: respectful, professional, calm. It was when they were finishing up in the hallway outside apartment 2B that the door opened downstairs and the cold entered again, not from the wind but from the man who walked in behind it. Walter Kent wore a gray wool coat and held his phone like it was part of his hand. He didn't look up right away. He didn't need to. The silence that followed his entrance was its own announcement. His shoes clicked against the tile, deliberate, slow. Jordan remained still. When Kent finally looked up, his eyes moved over Jordan with the casual scrutiny of someone inspecting something out of place. "Didn't know the city was sending social workers now," he said flatly. "What's your department up to, outreach or politics?" Jordan kept their posture neutral. "Housing inspections. We received multiple tenant complaints about lack of heat and hot water. This visit was logged with your office 2 days ago." Kent offered a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Fascinating. People these days file complaints like it's their full-time job." Jordan didn't respond to that. Instead, they took out their clipboard and made a quiet note. Behind them, Mrs. Alvarez slipped quietly back into her apartment and locked the door. Kent stepped closer, eyes narrowing slightly. "You know, I've run this building since before half the people here were born. No trouble until folks started showing up with clipboards and attitudes, stirring the pot, creating drama." There was a familiar edge to his tone, coded in civility yet soaked in condescension. Jordan had heard it before. It wasn't just about tenant rights or building management, it was personal. Kent's kind always made it personal. "Just here to do the job, Mr. Kent," Jordan said, their voice even. Kent leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "You're not from this neighborhood." Jordan looked him in the eye. "Born and raised in East New York, but that's not relevant here." Kent chuckled, shaking his head. "Sure you were. Maybe next time bring someone who understands how this place works." Jordan didn't reply. The insult wasn't subtle. It rarely was with men like Kent. They finished their notes, snapped a few quick photos of the exposed pipe near the stairwell, leaking slightly, and turned to leave. Kent didn't move. "I'll be talking to your supervisor," he said, voice calm but clipped. "I don't like people causing unnecessary problems in my building." Jordan paused mid-step. "That's your right, but I'd encourage you to read the complaint logs before you call. There are 6 of them from 3 different floors." Kent's smile twisted. People lie when they think it'll get them something, and your type always believes them. Jordan froze, the hallway went still. The phrase hung in the air, your type, and it wasn't hard to hear the layers in it. The meaning was there, not loud but undeniable. Jordan said nothing. They took one last look around, then walked out without another word. Back outside, the wind hadn't let up. Jordan pulled their coat tighter and walked a few steps before stopping at a bench near the bus stop. They sat, pulled out their phone, and opened their department's internal note-taking app. Every detail. Every comment, logged, time-stamped, tagged with location data. They weren't surprised. They were tired, but tired didn't mean powerless. As the city moved around them, cabs rolling past, the low murmur of conversation and traffic building, Jordan sat still, breathing steadily. They'd seen how this played out before. It always started with a quiet insult, a small dismissal, a sideways look, and then it escalated. But this time it would be different. This time they'd document everything. Let the system try to ignore that. The next morning, Jordan arrived early at the office. The fluorescent lights hummed faintly overhead, and the scent of burnt coffee lingered in the shared kitchen just down the hall. A few coworkers were already at their desks, murmuring into phones, tapping at keyboards, noses buried in case files. Jordan moved through it all with quiet efficiency, dropping their bag beside their cubicle and pulling out the folder from the Fulton Street visit. They stared at the field notes for a moment, rereading them like they were preparing for trial. Every word mattered. Every timestamp, every quote, every tiny detail had weight now. That hallway encounter, short as it was, had shifted something. It wasn't just another site visit, not anymore. Jordan opened the department portal and uploaded their report, attaching the photos and notes, then flagged it for review. Normally, that would be the end of it, but something told them it wouldn't be. By mid-morning, the email came in. Subject: Fulton Street Visit Supervisor Follow-up requested. It was from Aaron, their direct supervisor. A calendar invite was already attached, 15 minutes from now. Jordan sighed, stood, and smoothed the front of their shirt. They knocked once before entering Aaron's office. "Close the door," she said, not unkindly. Jordan sat across from her, already knowing what was coming. "So," Aaron began, fingers laced, "I got a call from Walter Kent this morning. He says you were rude, inappropriate, and tried to intimidate tenants into filing new complaints." Jordan didn't blink. "He confronted me during the visit, made several inappropriate remarks, one of which I've quoted in the report. I logged everything." Aaron held up a hand. "I believe you, but you know how this goes. He's got ties, donates to the councilman, runs 3 buildings in our district. I'm going to need to run this through legal before we move forward with any sanctions or formal reports." Jordan sat back. So he complains and the response is immediate. But when tenants complain for weeks, nothing happens until we escalate it ourselves. "I don't disagree," Aaron said quietly. "But you know the department, optics matter. If this gets messy, we have to be airtight." "I'm airtight," Jordan replied. "So are the tenants." Aaron gave them a long look. "Just be careful, okay? You're good at what you do. Don't give them a reason to question it." Jordan left the office with something heavier than frustration sitting in their chest. It wasn't just that Kent had made a complaint. It was how fast it had moved. One phone call and suddenly their credibility was under review. One rich landlord throwing a tantrum, and now Jordan's professionalism, something they guarded carefully, was up for debate. The rest of the week unfolded like a test. Calls from tenants slowed. A few canceled appointments. One, a young woman from the 3rd floor of Kent's building, texted Jordan late at night. "He said if we talk to you again, he'll terminate our lease." Jordan didn't respond right away. They read the message 3 times, then finally wrote back, "Everything stays confidential, but I understand if you're scared. Let me know if you ever want to talk again." The next morning, the message was deleted. Jordan sat in silence on the train to work, watching the blurred graffiti fly by through the window. The city's rhythm had a strange way of muting your outrage. There was always noise, always movement, always something worse around the corner. You had to be deliberate to be heard here. So Jordan decided to be deliberate. They returned to Fulton Street 3 days later. This time with a printed copy of the original complaint packet and a body-worn camera tucked discreetly under their jacket. Official issue, used rarely but always available for field agents when needed. They knocked on a few familiar doors. Mrs. Alvarez cracked hers open just a few inches. "I shouldn't be talking to you," she said quickly. "He put something on my door, a notice." "Retaliation?" Jordan asked. She nodded but didn't show it. "He said my unit, due for inspection, said if I don't pass, I'm out." Jordan didn't press. "I'm not asking for anything more, just wanted you to know the report's still active. You're not alone." Before she could answer, footsteps echoed down the stairs. Heavy, slow, familiar. Kent appeared again like clockwork. "You've got nerve," he said, not raising his voice but carrying the threat just fine in the tone. Jordan didn't flinch, conducting a follow-up. A tenant filed a new complaint yesterday. It was rooted to me. Funny how you're the only one who seems to find problems in my building, Kent said, almost like you're creating them. Jordan stared at him. Or maybe I'm just the only one documenting what everyone else ignores. Kent took another step forward, closer now. You're not the first loudmouth the city's sent through here, but they come and go, I stay, always do. His breath smelled faintly of something bitter. Jordan felt the hairs on their arms rise, but they didn't move. You're trying to make this personal, Jordan said softly, but it's not. This is policy, this is law. Kent chuckled low in his throat. People like you, always hiding behind procedure, always waving around rules like it protects you, but it won't. Jordan let the silence stretch a beat too long, then finally spoke. This interaction is being recorded. Kent blinked, his smirk faltered just enough to notice. Jordan didn't wait for more. They turned, walked back out into the street, and only once they reached the corner did they allow their pulse to show on their face. They spent the next 2 days uploading everything. The video, the audio. Copies of the eviction threats residents had managed to slip under their office door. Screenshots of texts, timestamps, the whole timeline. And then, just as they were finishing the draft of a formal internal complaint, their phone buzzed. Unknown number. Voicemail. Jordan played it back. Hey, my name's Anna. I used to live in Kent's building on South Portland. Got your number from someone still living there. I heard what's happening. I had my own experience. Thought maybe it was just me. But now I'm not so sure. If you're collecting stories, I've got one. Jordan stared at the phone, then slowly sat down. It had started. The moment you name the pattern, people come out of the woodwork. They always do. When they know they're not alone, they speak. Jordan opened a fresh file on their desktop. Kent Pattern South Portland/Fulton case. They typed the first line, contact, Anna, former tenant, willing to testify. The fight wasn't just about one insult anymore. It never was. Anna's voice trembled slightly when she spoke, but her words were clear. Jordan sat on the edge of a worn plastic chair in a coffee shop tucked between a laundromat and a beauty supply store in Fort Greene. It was late afternoon. The windows fogged slightly from the warmth inside, battling the chill air outside. Anna sipped from a chipped ceramic mug, hands wrapped around it like it was the only thing anchoring her. I didn't say anything at the time, she said, eyes on the steam rising from her cup. Back then I thought it'd just blow over, thought if I didn't react he'd back off. Jordan listened without interrupting, hands folded calmly in their lap. He figured out I was gay before I ever told anyone in the building, Anna said, her eyes finally meeting Jordan's. Started with weird questions. Who was that girl who came over last night? You have a roommate. What's her name? Then the water pressure dropped for 2 weeks straight in my unit. My rent was accidentally raised. Then the noise complaints started, ones I never made. Jordan nodded slowly. Did you document any of it? Anna gave a dry laugh. I didn't think I needed to. I thought it was in my head until I heard what he said to you. Jordan had shared the quote. The one Kent delivered in the hallway, cool and calculated. Your type always believes them. He said something almost identical to me, Anna continued, and I didn't even have a clipboard. Jordan sat back, the pieces arranging themselves in their mind. There were patterns in Kent's behavior, not just hostility but strategy. He never moved too fast. He used pressure, subtle punishments, unspoken rules. He relied on the silence of his victims, and most of the time it worked. But now the silence was cracking. Anna agreed to file a statement, carefully worded, factual, just enough to create a tether between her experience and the one Jordan was building. It wouldn't be admissible on its own, but it was a start. Jordan walked home that night under a sky smeared with low gray clouds. Traffic hummed nearby, but their thoughts were louder. This wasn't just a petty landlord throwing his weight around. Kent was part of a system that had been allowed to operate unchecked because no one forced it to look at itself, and now that someone had, it would push back. At work the next morning, Jordan found a new email waiting. Subject: Fulton complaint escalation, legal advisement required. Attached was a memo from the department's legal advisor. The tone was cautious, clinical. It outlined concern about potentially unsubstantiated accusations against a property owner with considerable legal resources. There was a suggestion, no, a warning, that further action without stronger evidence could compromise departmental neutrality. Jordan exhaled through their nose, not surprised but still disheartened. The message was clear: proceed carefully or risk being painted as the problem. They walked down the hallway to Erin's office again, the second time in as many weeks. She was on the phone when Jordan entered, waving them in with a tired motion. I saw the memo, Jordan said quietly once she hung up. Erin nodded. They're nervous. Kent's lawyers already sent over a preemptive notice about defamation. They're playing chess. Jordan's mouth was tight. So we stop moving, let him keep doing it because he's louder and richer. No, Aaron said, we just need to move smarter. She reached into a drawer and pulled out a folder. Inside was a printed email with a highlighted section. Jordan scanned it. Heard you might be dealing with Kent, it read. If that's true, I'd be willing to talk. Had my own experience last year. We've got contacts in legal advocacy, might be useful. There was a name at the bottom, Rachel Levin, a housing advocate and lawyer with the Equal Shelter Initiative, a nonprofit watchdog group. Jordan looked up. You reached out. No, Aaron said. She did. Saw your name come up in an internal database of field visits. I guess word, getting around. The next day, Jordan met Rachel at a tiny nonprofit office above a halal grocery store near Atlantic Avenue. Her handshake was firm, her expression open. A white woman in her early 40s, dressed plainly, with sharp eyes and the kind of calm that came from years of legal battles. I've seen Kent's name before, she said, flipping through a binder thick with documents. Never stuck, but there's chatter, unofficial reports, whisper networks. We've been trying to get something concrete for years. Jordan sat across from her, laying out the pieces. The interaction, the threats, the tenant fears, Anna's testimony, the footage. Rachel listened closely, her pen moving without pause. Do you have access to building inspection logs? She asked. Yes. And eviction patterns. I can get them. Rachel nodded. We'll need all of it. Evictions disproportionately targeting queer tenants, especially Black and Latinx ones, that's the thread. If we can prove a pattern across multiple buildings, the city has no choice but to act. Jordan felt a strange rush in their chest, not relief exactly, but something close. For the first time, it didn't feel like they were screaming into the wind. Back at the office, Jordan began pulling records, cross-referencing complaint logs, matching names, comparing dates. Every few hours, another piece dropped into place. A tenant evicted after filing a noise complaint. A lease terminated after a same-sex partner moved in. Late-night inspections with no written follow-up. And always Kent's name somewhere at the bottom of the paperwork. It wasn't perfect. Some files were incomplete, some too old to use, but the outline was forming. Later that week, Jordan received another voicemail, this time from someone inside the housing department. I heard what you're doing, the voice said. Just watch your back. Kent has people everywhere. Jordan saved the message. They weren't surprised. When systems are built to protect the powerful, those who challenge them become targets, but something had shifted. They weren't alone anymore. Rachel connected Jordan with two former tenants who had moved out of state but were willing to submit written testimonies. Anna passed along the name of another woman, quiet, scared, but ready. The file grew thicker. On Friday, Jordan walked into Aaron's office and placed the folder on her desk. This is a preliminary pattern file. 3 buildings, 11 tenants, 6 documented threats, 4 evictions following protected complaints, 1 confirmed falsified inspection report. Aaron looked at the folder, then at Jordan. You're sure about this? Yes. She nodded, then we take it up the ladder. Jordan left the office and stood in the hallway for a long moment, staring at nothing. The hum of fluorescent lights above, the sound of a copy machine churning out pages, the low murmur of someone arguing with it down the hall, all of it felt far away. This wasn't the end, but it was the shift, the ground moving beneath the silence. For the first time, the system had to listen. It started with a letter, one of those cheap manila envelopes slipped under a door in the early hours of the morning. No postage, no return address, just Jordan's name in tight block letters on the front. It was waiting when they opened their office door on Monday. Inside was a printed copy of a job application they'd submitted 7 years ago before they joined the department. Pages marked up in red pen, circles around typos, notes in the margins questioning experience gaps. At the bottom, a single line typed, "Some people don't belong in positions of influence, especially when they're hiding things." Jordan stared at the page for a long time, feeling the weight of it settle in their chest. Not the words, not the criticism, but the intent. Someone had gone digging, deep. Someone wanted them to feel hunted. They folded the letter, placed it in a plastic evidence sleeve, and dropped it in the file. It didn't stop there. The next day, their department email was flooded with sudden inquiries. Random audits on old case files. A flagged inspection report from 2 years ago that had never been an issue before. Requests to justify travel logs, verify timestamps, explain decisions that were long closed. Nothing serious on its own, but together the message was clear. Someone wanted to rattle the walls. By midweek, a new rumor had taken root, quiet but persistent. Whispers that Jordan had falsified a report in exchange for favors. No one said it aloud in meetings, but the glances lingered longer. Conversations stopped when they entered the room. Jordan didn't rise to it, didn't chase down the rumors or demand explanations. They just documented every shift in tone, every routine review that seemed misplaced, every email that suddenly took on a different weight. They logged it all. Rachel wasn't surprised. "This is textbook," she said, pacing the small office above the halal store. "He can't silence you outright, so he's going to try and drown you in noise, make enough static that people start to question the signal." Jordan looked up. "He's weaponizing the system, and it's working." "Only if you let it isolate you," she said. "You're not the only one they've tried this on." She handed over a USB drive. "3 statements," she continued. One from a former housing inspector who quit after being reassigned every time they flagged Kent, one from a maintenance worker who saw him shredding tenant files, and one from a woman who was offered cash to move out right after she came out to her landlord. Kent's name is in all 3. Jordan took the drive, closing their fingers around it like it was something alive. The file was growing, and with it the pushback. That weekend they found a smear article online. Low-level, poorly written, hosted on a blog site no one credible used, but it had their name, their photo, and an accusation of bias in government service. It quoted anonymous, former tenants claiming they felt targeted. It even used the phrase militant activist. Jordan stared at the screen, unmoving, until their brother, Chris, walked into the room. "Is that about you?" he asked, peering over their shoulder. Jordan quickly shut the laptop. "Nothing important." Chris didn't buy it, but he didn't press. Just said, "You want tea," and disappeared into the kitchen. Later, when Jordan opened the laptop again, they filed a report on the article, screenshot every page, and added it to the file. Then they reached out to a contact they hadn't spoken to in months. Maya Washington, a journalist at a mid-tier publication that specialized in housing rights and city policy. She interviewed Jordan once, years ago, about illegal lockouts. They still had her number. The reply came quickly. "I've heard about Kent, I'm in, but I'll need sources willing to go on record." Jordan hesitated. "That might take time." "I can wait," Maya said. "But just know once this goes public, everything changes." Jordan knew, but silence had stopped being an option. The following Monday, Erin called them into her office again. This time she looked tired, not annoyed, not defensive, just worn out. "We've got a problem," she said, handing over a printed memo. "An ethics review has been triggered, anonymous submission. Accuses you of targeting landlords based on personal bias." Jordan didn't even blink. "Let me guess, no evidence." "None that's been shared so far," she said. "But the review board has to follow protocol. You'll be interviewed next week." Jordan nodded. "I'll be ready." They returned to their desk and opened the file again. Added a new tab, Institutional Retaliation. Time, date, action taken, screenshot of the memo. It was beginning to look like a court case, not a field report. That afternoon, another voicemail came through, this one different. A man's voice, quiet, nervous. "My name's Kevin. I used to do maintenance at one of Kent's buildings. I was told to shut off the boiler on a Friday night so tenants would complain Monday. Said it'd make those people easier to evict. I didn't know who to tell back then, but I've got records, pay stubs, work orders. Let me know if you want them." Jordan saved the message, then backed it up twice. Later that night, they sat on their fire escape, staring out at the city, windows glowing like stars, the distant hum of trains rolling beneath the streets, a siren cutting through the cold. They weren't afraid, not exactly, but they felt the pressure. It pressed behind their eyes and their shoulders, coiled tight in their chest. It was the weight of being visible in a system that preferred shadows. They remembered something Rachel had said days ago. "He's betting on you folding, not because you're weak, but because he knows the system will do most of the work for him." And maybe that was true. Maybe the system had its hands all over this, keeping things quiet, protecting its own. But Jordan wasn't folding. They'd come too far, collected too many voices, drawn too many lines between dots everyone pretended didn't connect. This wasn't just about Kent anymore. It was about what Kent represented, how easily harm could be hidden behind bureaucracy, how silence was used as a shield, and how people like Jordan were expected to take the hits quietly. But they weren't quiet anymore. The article dropped on a Thursday. It wasn't a full exposé, not yet, just a carefully constructed piece under Maya Washington's byline, built from verifiable details and corroborated statements. It outlined a concerning trend across 3 rent-stabilized buildings in Brooklyn: a landlord with a documented history of tenant intimidation, multiple eviction notices filed against LGBTQ+ tenants after protected complaints, and a city department caught in the slow churn of investigation. No names were mentioned outright, but anyone in the know would see it for what it was, a warning shot across Kent's bow. By noon, the piece had started to ripple through housing advocacy circles. Jordan watched from their desk as the emails came in, quiet messages of support from fellow caseworkers, a few brave tenants asking if it was safe to speak. One former supervisor from another borough simply wrote, "About time someone said something." The phone rang. "Erin," she didn't sound surprised. "I assume you saw the article." I did. You know they'll come harder now. I know. Aaron sighed. Just keep everything tight, no improvising. If legal asks questions, give them facts, only facts. Jordan closed the call and leaned back in their chair. For the first time in weeks, they didn't feel like they were losing ground. Kent hadn't responded publicly. That wasn't his style, but the pressure had shifted. People were watching now, and people like Kent hated being watched. Late that afternoon, Jordan received a message from Anna. "Thank you. I never thought anyone would care enough to push this far." They stared at the words for a long moment before replying. "It's not just for you, it never was." The next day, someone slipped a flyer under their door at the office, poorly made, pixelated, probably printed from a gas station computer. It read, "LGBTQ radicals are ruining our communities. Demand accountability." Jordan added it to the file without a second thought. At this point, it was almost expected, but something else arrived that day too, a letter from the Equal Shelter Initiative notifying the Housing Department of a formal inquiry. The nonprofit was requesting an internal audit of all Kent-affiliated properties, citing emerging patterns of discrimination and potential civil rights violations. Rachel had moved, and she wasn't alone. Jordan met her again that weekend, this time at a small community event hosted in a church basement in Crown Heights. There were folding chairs, lukewarm coffee, and a row of tired but determined people lining up to speak. Former tenants, advocates, one housing inspector who'd driven in from the Bronx. "We're not calling it a protest," Rachel said. "We're calling it a listening session. That way the press can't write it off as another angry crowd." Jordan smiled faintly. "Smart." "Always," she replied. "The system hears anger and goes deaf, but it can't ignore grief or testimony." As the microphone passed from hand to hand, stories poured out. Each one echoed with familiarity: delayed repairs after complaints, sudden lease terminations, slurs muttered under breath, heat mysteriously turned off in the middle of winter. Kent's name came up 5 times in 2 hours, and every time someone nodded in quiet recognition. Jordan didn't speak that day. They sat in the back taking notes, watching the slow unraveling of a carefully maintained silence. It wasn't just about proving Kent wrong anymore. It was about building something no one could ignore. When they returned to the office on Monday, they found the department in a quiet state of alert. The director had issued a staff-wide memo, a reminder about public accountability, community trust, and maintaining professionalism in all field work. It was vague. It didn't mention the article or the inquiry, but it said enough. Later that week, Aaron pulled Jordan into a side meeting. "We've been asked to cooperate with Equal Shelter's audit," she said. "They want to see inspection records, complaint logs, anything that hasn't already been scrubbed." Jordan raised an eyebrow. "Scrubbed?" Aaron didn't answer right away. "Some older files are missing, years back, digital migration, nothing recent, but it's not complete." Jordan felt the familiar sting of frustration, and "We didn't think to back any of that up." "We weren't looking for patterns back then," she said. "We were just moving paperwork." Jordan left the meeting with a new urgency. They called Maya that night. "Dig into property transfers," they said. "Find out who Kent sold to, leased through, subcontracted with. If he's hiding behind shell companies, I want to know." Maya promised to get her team on it. The next break came from someone Jordan hadn't expected, a junior staffer named Leela who worked in the department's records division. She stopped Jordan in the hallway one morning, glancing around before speaking. "I saw what you're doing," she said quietly. "And I think there's more. I've been restoring old inspection files from before the migration. Some of the ones that disappeared, they weren't lost, they were buried." Jordan stared at her. "You can prove that." "Give me time," she said. "I'm careful." Over the next 2 weeks, more names surfaced, more connections. Rachel provided a list of settlements that had never gone to court, confidential agreements, payouts in exchange for silence. Kent had been busy, very busy, and for a long time, but now the silence was working against him. At the next internal review, Jordan sat across from 3 legal representatives and answered every question with precision. They provided copies of statements, timelines, receipts, messages. They didn't flinch. When the question of personal bias came up, they handed over a list of every inspection conducted in the past year, dozens of properties, evenly distributed, none of them outside protocol. The committee didn't say much, but their eyes moved differently now, not with suspicion, with recognition. After the meeting, Jordan walked to the break room and poured a cup of coffee. Aaron joined them a few moments later. "You did good," she said. "They won't say it, but you did." Jordan nodded. "It's not about me." "I know," Aaron said, "but you still did good." That night, Jordan received an email from Maya with the subject line, "Got it." Attached was a PDF of a property ownership chain 3 degrees removed from Kent but leading back to him. A building on South Portland had been registered under a company that shared an address with one of Kent's LLCs. 2 tenants had filed civil rights complaints after being evicted. The complaints had gone nowhere, until now. Jordan sat back, heart steady. The system wasn't moving fast, but it was moving. The next day, Equal Shelter filed a petition to the city council for an independent inquiry into housing discrimination patterns in Brooklyn. Jordan wasn't mentioned by name in the filing, but their fingerprints were all over it. And for the first time, the silence around Kent wasn't just breaking, it was shattering. The hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday. It wasn't front-page news, not yet. Just a public city council session on housing equity, buried midway through the docket, slotted between sidewalk permits and sanitation budgets. But for those who had been watching the ripples build, it was the moment everything started to come into focus. Jordan arrived early. The municipal building's stone walls rose like something ancient, cold even in the spring warmth. The hall outside the chamber buzzed with low voices, attorneys, aides, a few activists, a handful of reporters idling by the door. Jordan spotted Rachel near the entrance, holding a folder thick with documents, her face calm, professional. "You ready?" she asked. Jordan nodded. "You." Rachel gave a faint smile. "Always." Inside the chamber, the seats began to fill. Council members shuffled papers and adjusted microphones. A clerk read out procedural language while a monotone voice echoed over the speaker system. It all felt bureaucratic, almost dull, until the names started. Walter Kent was not present. His legal representative, a man with slick-back hair and a forced smile, took a seat near the front. He didn't speak to anyone. Jordan sat behind the row of witnesses, hands folded, face blank. They testified before, field updates, inspection summaries, budget clarifications. This was different. The first to speak was Rachel. She laid it out like a story, measured, chronological, unemotional. She cited case numbers, presented complaint timelines, referenced the documented discrepancies in heat maintenance logs and eviction notices. She didn't accuse, she pointed. Let the data speak. Then came 2 former tenants, both soft-spoken, visibly nervous. One described losing their home days after reporting a plumbing issue. The other spoke of unexplained fees, hostile phone calls, and a lease non-renewal after their partner moved in. The council listened, mostly. One member checked his phone until another nudged him, then they called Jordan. They stood slowly, every movement deliberate, walking to the table with the kind of calm that comes from weeks of preparation. No notes, just memory and truth. They described the initial inspection. The hallway. The threats that followed, the retaliation both institutional and personal, and then the pattern. One voice became 2, then 4, then 11. A chorus of testimony built brick by brick. When they mentioned the article, a few heads in the gallery nodded. When they brought up the digital paper trail, deleted files, reappearing documents, matching addresses across LLCs, there was a pause, a shift. The weight of it began to settle in the room. The lawyer stood when they were done, objecting not formally but enough to cast doubt. He used words like hearsay and bias. He spoke of long-standing community leadership and character smears. But it didn't land like it once would have. There were too many voices now. Outside, reporters waited by the steps. Maya stood among them, notepad in hand, nodding once as Jordan exited. "You're part of the record now," she said. "They can't pretend it's not real." Jordan didn't respond right away. They looked back at the building, at the carved facade, at the windows gleaming in the morning light. "It's not justice yet," they said. "No," Maya agreed. "But it's where it starts." The fallout didn't come all at once. It rarely does. First, Kent's properties were quietly flagged for audit. Then his name was removed from a short list of contributors to a housing development fund. A city housing commissioner issued a statement, neutral in tone but acknowledging the need for greater scrutiny of landlords with repeated community concerns. Behind closed doors, more began to stir. The Equal Shelter initiative received an influx of calls from tenants. Some were vague, hesitant. Others were detailed, angry, ready. Patterns emerged faster now. Kent's name kept appearing. Within 2 weeks, a formal complaint was filed with the State Human Rights Division. It cited housing discrimination, retaliation, and civil rights violations. Jordan's documentation was included as part of the evidence package. So were the testimonies. Kent responded through his lawyer with a statement of complete denial, accusing the city of targeting successful property owners. He filed a countersuit against the Equal Shelter initiative for defamation. It didn't gain traction. At work, Jordan noticed the shift. Where once there had been silence or distance, now there were nods in the hallway, emails that began with "thank you," a quiet support blooming in small, scattered ways. Erin stopped by their desk one afternoon. "We just got word," she said, holding up a sheet of paper. "Legal's dropping the ethics review, no basis." Jordan took the paper, scanned it once, and placed it aside. "Good," they said without much expression. Aaron sat down across from them. I know I haven't said much, but what you're doing matters. Jordan looked at her. I wasn't trying to be a symbol. You're not, she said. You're a professional doing your job and forcing everyone else to do theirs. By the time summer approached, the city council announced a task force on housing discrimination. It was largely symbolic, but it included seats for community advocates. Rachel was offered one. She accepted. That same week, a tenant from one of Kent's buildings called Jordan directly. They didn't say much, just that they were grateful, that for the first time in years, repairs had been made without delay. The heat worked. The plumbing held. No strange notices taped to their door. I don't know what you did, they said, but it's different now. Jordan ended the call and sat for a while, the afternoon sun cutting sharp angles across their desk. They didn't feel triumphant, not exactly. The process had left a mark: long nights, thin patience, a quiet fatigue behind the eyes, but beneath that there was a steadiness, a kind of peace that didn't depend on applause or headlines. They opened the case file one last time, reviewed the notes, then saved a final copy and archived it. Justice didn't always arrive in thunder. Sometimes it came like this, document by document, name by name, a slow unearthing of truth that refused to be buried again. And sometimes the reckoning wasn't loud. It was patient. It was inevitable. By autumn, the city had changed. Not in grand, sweeping ways, not in the kind of transformations politicians chased in campaign speeches or promised in interviews. The skyline was still the same, subways still late, sirens still crying through the night. But something quieter had shifted. People were watching more closely. Departments that once moved sluggishly now responded with a certain tension in their posture, a readiness that hadn't been there before. Jordan noticed it first in the way new inspections were handled. No more sudden cancellations, no more unexplained reassignments. When they entered buildings now, they were met with a new kind of respect, sometimes reluctant, sometimes quiet, but always there. The silence that once met their presence had softened. They returned to Fulton Street in early September unannounced. Not as a warning, not for revenge, just to check. To make sure the noise hadn't settled back into its old rhythms. The building looked cleaner. The radiator in the front hall no longer hissed with rot. Someone had repainted the stairwell. Mrs. Alvarez opened her door before Jordan even knocked. She didn't smile, but she stepped aside and let them in. It's been quiet, she said. No more letters, no more threats. The heat stayed on through the summer. Jordan nodded. That's good. She looked at them for a long moment before asking, He's gone, isn't he? He sold the property last month. It's under new management now. Mrs. Alvarez sat down at her small kitchen table, the sunlight catching on her chipped coffee mug. He thought we were all going to disappear. Jordan didn't answer. They didn't need to. The answer was in every tenant still here, every person who had chosen to stay and speak. Outside, the street hummed with late summer traffic. Kids played near the stoop. A teenager sat on the curb with a basketball, earbuds in. Jordan stood on the sidewalk for a few extra minutes after leaving the building. They didn't look back. The Equal Shelter Initiative continued its work. Rachel had taken on more staff, most of them former tenants or advocates who'd found their voices during the investigation. The task force meetings were ongoing, sometimes slow, sometimes frustrating, but the doors stayed open. That mattered. Maya's article series had grown into a full feature, 5 parts chronicling the arc from that first inspection on Fulton to the hearing to the lawsuit that was now winding its way through the courts. Kent had vanished from public view. Rumor was he'd left the state. No one missed him. At home, things were quieter. Chris had started taking night classes again, talking about maybe going back into community health work. He asked fewer questions now, not because he wasn't curious, but because he trusted the silence when Jordan said, I'm good. And Jordan was not perfect, not untouched by it all, but grounded. They still woke up some nights with their mind racing, replaying conversations, scanning for mistakes, still felt a flicker of anger when old faces crossed their thoughts. But the feeling didn't stay like it used to. It passed. It made room for other things. One morning, they received a letter in the mail. Handwritten, folded twice, the kind of thing you knew was real before you even opened it. Dear Jordan, I wanted to say thank you. I don't know if you remember me. I used to live on South Portland, 2 doors down from that building with the green awning. You probably never knew what you started when you filed that report. I was too scared to speak back then. Thought it wouldn't matter, but it did. I'm safe now. I have a place where I'm not afraid to answer the door. What you did, it rippled. Thank you for not letting it go. T. Jordan folded the letter carefully and placed it in the drawer beside their bed. The recognition wasn't public, and that was fine. There were no awards, no interviews, no plaques, just moments like this, quiet acknowledgments from people whose names weren't in the case file but whose lives had changed because someone chose to speak when it was hardest. One evening, Rachel called with an update. The city had agreed to new reporting protocols for tenant harassment claims. Third-party audits would now be mandatory for flagged properties. It wasn't everything, but it was real. "We're still in it," she said, "but we've moved the needle." Jordan smiled. "That's all I ever wanted." Before they hung up, Rachel added, "You ever think about doing this full-time, legal work advocacy?" Jordan glanced around their apartment, the stack of reports on the table, the community bulletin on the fridge, the slow, patient rhythm they'd carved out again. "I already am," they said. Months passed, the cold returned to the city, the leaves turned then fell, rent hearings resumed. Another tenant, this time in Harlem, filed a formal complaint. It wasn't connected to Kent. But the process that followed, the swift response, the careful investigation, the oversight, it bore the marks of what had come before. Jordan stood in front of the mirror one morning, adjusting the ID badge clipped to their coat. The city still asked a lot, still pulled in a dozen directions at once, but it listened more now, and that was enough. They stepped outside into the sharp breath of winter air and made their way toward the train station. The work went on, so did they, and behind them the silence left behind by Kent and others like him stayed broken. Where once there had been fear, there was now room for truth, and in that truth justice had taken root, not loudly, but completely.